Restoration, I want to kick off this morning by asking you this question. How much do you have in common with your neighbor? All right, think about that just for a second. How much do you have in common with your neighbor? Now today, I want to encourage you to stretch your view of who your neighbor is out a little bit further than what I usually encourage you. Usually I encourage you to look at your neighbor as your literal next door neighbor. Yes, but let me ask you to stretch it a little further. Would your neighbor be today the person who you work with? And maybe your neighbor today is the one who doesn't vote the same way you're going to vote in November. Or maybe it's the person, your neighbor, who isn't from the same culture, isn't from the same country you're from. Maybe you get the idea. So let me ask the question again. How much do you have in common with your neighbor? We live in a culture where the gospel is under attack. Right? I would argue that we live in a culture where being a follower of Jesus isn't in vogue, right? It's actually marginalized, if you will, in our culture. So when it comes to you and I loving our neighbor so that we could share the gospel, what do we need more of? Because Paul says in Romans chapter 1, verse 16, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel." So do we need more boldness? Maybe. Do we need more courage? Maybe. But I think we need more than that. I think we need a change of perspective. Again, I want you to kind of keep in mind your neighbor, right? The one who doesn't vote the way you vote, the one who isn't from where you're from. You know what I mean. I think we need to adopt the attitude of the Apostle Paul in 1 Timothy 1:15 when he says, "For Christ came to save sinners." And then Paul says this, "Of which I am the foremost." Essentially what Paul is saying is, Christ came to save sinners, of which I'm the worst, is another way of saying that. Now, let me ask you to think about this. The tense of which Paul uses there. Paul doesn't say, Christ came to save sinners, of which I used to be. Paul doesn't say, for Christ came to save sinners, but now I'm no longer like my neighbor. No, Paul says, for Christ came to save sinners, of which I am the foremost, which I'm the worst. So let me ask you again, how much do you have in common with your neighbor? You see, I think for us to love our neighbors so that we could share the gospel, it's really easy, again, if they grew up where we grew up from, if they look like we look, if they, live like we live, if they have the same worldview, the same economic standards, all those things, it's easy. But I think what's even easier is when we recognize that we have a lot more in common with all of our neighbors than we think. Especially if we look at it in light of what the Apostle Paul says, for Christ came to save sinners, of which I'm the worst. You see, I think what we need the most of is mercy. And mercy is most easily dispensed by those who recognize their need for it the most. I want to encourage you to look at your neighbor that way in terms of mercy, in terms of the grace by which you've been saved and the mission of Jesus, which was to save sinners, of which you and I are the worst. Just a little bit of encouragement for today. Hey, listen, Restoration, we're going to continue our My House series this Sunday. I'm going to call an audible. I don't know if I ate a bad burrito when I was preparing. I don't know if the Spirit is whatever, but the Spirit has moved me to change the message for this Sunday. So this Sunday, I'm going to actually just address a topic that I think every home deals with, especially in light of the baggage that maybe we bring in from our parents who brought it in from their parents. You get the idea. I want to encourage you to be there this Sunday. Hey, don't forget about baptism coming up the week after sports camp, Saturday at the beach, which I believe is June 15th. And then on Father's Day, which is a Sunday, we'll have baptism in the worship center as well. You're not going to want to miss Father's Day. It's going to be a beautiful time, a little bit different teaching that day. It's going to have a panel of fathers up there just doing a little Q&A. And we'll all be teaching as we answer the questions. Listen, sports camp, more information at the bottom. There's still a few spots remaining. Listen, be on mission. I love you. See you on Sunday, church.